Hi, I'm Dan Forbush. Welcome to this first in a series of interviews we'll do monthly with experts on Warren County's First People. Today, we're diving deep into the Southern Adirondacks' Indigenous past with Skidmore College anthropologists Susan Bender and Siobhan Hart. This is the unedited version of the conversation we boiled down to its essence on Stories from Open Space. You'll find it on our collaborative history blog. Professor Bender opened by talking about persistent places. That was interesting. And so we just rolled into it.
The notion of persistent places, I think that Melissa Otis, who wrote the book Rural Indigenousness, which I know Siobhan also regards highly as a text that I suggest people might want to reference. But she also uses the term location of exchange, and I think that these are very much the same kind of concepts. We tend to think in our culture of the landscape as being divided into territories with drawn boundaries around them, and then having sort of ownership of some entity of that chunk of the landscape. And we think of these as, if you will, domains, ownership domains, if you will, with clear boundaries. Indigenous people interacted with the landscape in very different ways. While they had homelands, to be sure, these are more territories, fuzzy bounded territories, if you will, with through which people moved as they pursued their seasonal economic activities. And within these movements, there were places that had specific meaning, often visited not just by one particular, if you will, tribal or band or ethnic entity, but sometimes by multiple ones. And they all had stories around these places. And these stories create a relationship between the people and the landscape, or they both create and express the relationship between Indigenous peoples in the landscape, which they considered their homeland and upon which they depended, and with which they had many different kinds of reciprocal relationships. Persistent places, I think we can think of as then points on a landscape that had particular significance and meaning, were often visited by one or more ethnic groups. Siobhan, anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that was a great way to frame and open up the discussion. And one of the things I would underscore there is that thinking about places as being, part of these very complex and extended networks of footpaths and waterways and fishing sites and resource locations like groves of nut trees and fields and grazing areas and wetlands and shellfish collecting places and beaches and living sites being part of that much larger interconnected network of places. And then within those places, you have, some places that are the places where and the remains of ancestors are put to rest, or where ceremony takes place. And those kinds of places may or may not have material evidence there, right? As archaeologists, Sue and I, our attention is to the places where there is material evidence, where there are artifacts and other evidence of things that people did in the past. But those places that have that material evidence are not the only places within homelands that are significant places. So thinking about, places that may be less visible materially, but are still very much part of this larger network of important places spiritually, symbolically, economically, culturally, politically oriented places, I think is one thing that we want to kind of, keep in our field of view. And then the other thing is that coming back to this idea of persistent places, that places can accumulate meaning and significance over time, and that meaning may extend beyond an actual residency, right? So in the Northeast, we have a long history of the diaspora of Indigenous communities and colonialism as a significant force that forcibly removed Indigenous peoples from these homelands. And that removal doesn't mean that the places have lost meaning and connection to contemporary Indigenous communities. So thinking about those kinds of accrued experiences that may also transcend both time, but also transcend the kind of cultural occupation. So multiple and different ethnic or cultural groups occupying, say, the same place or having a connection to that same place. The last thing I'll say on this is that I think is a really important point that Melissa Otis raises in that rural indigenousness book is this reciprocal, thinking about the relationship between people and land being one of reciprocity as opposed to one of extraction. So she offers us the indigenous idea and practice of people caring for the land as opposed to the land belonging to people. And I think that that's something that when we think about Indigenous relationships to land in the past as well as in the present, we need to sort of shift our colonized thinking to recognize that reciprocal relationship and that relationship of care.
So in our project, we want to tell the stories of these persistent places or these locations of exchange. How does everything that you've told us thus far relate to that project? What advice do you have as we go about trying to capture the stories and then pinpoint them on a map?
That entails a whole lot of research, and I don't think I'm certainly not, having not worked in the Northeast for almost 30 years. I'm not in a position to say this place or that place or the other place. I think the consultation with people who are currently active doing archaeological research are certainly one way to go about it. There are also at the time of contact, there's documentary evidence that talks about some of them. I think I mentioned to you earlier, Dan, about Hudson Crossing being an excellent example of the way in which a place can be talked about imaginatively to bring about the presence of Indigenous people in that area, and in that case, the Mohegans living up and down the Upper Hudson River Valley. They do a nice job of that. I think you don't need necessarily, and Siobhan, I don't, you might disagree with me on this, but I would say you don't need necessarily to take people to a sacred place in order to get them to think about these places. What you can do is populate a landscape with a history that includes Indigenous experience in that area. And there's certainly lots of directions. I mean, since you're working primarily in Warren County, there are lots of directions in rural Indigenous that could take you to places that would do that. Homesteads, for example, of of Indigenous people, areas where they lived. And even though there might not no longer be, and this is in sort of the 17th, 18th or 19th century, excuse me, not 17th, 18th or 19th century, there are records of families, Indigenous families living in that landscape. And even if the homes are no longer there, it seems to me that there's still an opening to talk about Indigenous people's experience on this landscape.
So Sarah might be able to contribute something on this. It seems to me we can create layers on this story map. So it seems to me that one layer could be highly visible public places that we encourage people to go visit and actually see. And we've come up with about a list of those, including Cohoes Falls, the various forts where there were key battles, where the First Nations were key participants and so forth. But then it seems to me that there are these other places that are important historically, but we're not encouraging anyone to go there. We want people to know about them. We want to tell the stories, but it's not public. So Sarah, would it make sense to think about our map in those two parts?
Sure. Yeah, I think, just identifying these places is obviously the challenge, as Sue was saying. I imagine, take a fair amount of research. I don't know what sorts of already identified locations we have.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, it's just a thought. That's going forward. I'm kind of thinking in those terms of, separating two categories of places that we want to be spotlighting. And thank you for being with us, Sarah. I know you're not feeling well today, but it's great to have you with us.
One example might be just the Saratoga Lake Fish Creek River, Fish Creek Valley, if you will.
Oh yeah.
Clearly, to talk about as a place. What do you think about that, Siobhan?
Yeah, the other thing I was thinking about was, the precise site locations may not be available, but you should be able to, as representative, through a representative of the county, to get information from the New York State SHPO's office, the State Historic Preservation Office, about just the number of, how many documented pre-contact Indigenous sites have been documented in Warren County. I mean, anytime there's any sort, a new cell tower, a road widening, any kind of publicly funded project, there is a requirement for an assessment and mitigation of impacts on cultural resources, and that often includes some kind of assessment of Indigenous impact to Indigenous sites. So those are some of the things that I think, ways to make places that are otherwise invisible to people more visible, right? Populating the whole landscape, not just those places that people already sort of think about. Okay, well, if I want to learn about Indigenous histories or Indigenous perspectives about this, I'm going to go to this museum or this historic site, or there's the marker, there's the marker in High Rock Park, and I'll, read the bronze plaque. I think that the power of a story map, and I've used some story maps in my own work, the power there is that you kind of transcend place, right? You can capture, you can provide place-based knowledge and stories, but you don't have to send people, out into the world and onto private property and, so forth. So some of that information about, just what kinds of sites are there in Warren County? Are there Paleo-Indian sites in Warren County? Is there, my guess is that there's probably been some that have been documented.
So I believe Don Rittner, our Historical Society director, who is, I think, also an archaeologist and is working with one of our interns, Skidmore interns, have requested the data from SHPO. I think there are a very minimal number of documented sites in Warren County, but there are at least a couple, maybe not more than that, though. So
Yeah, you're right about that. As I recall, there's just not that much, you know.
Well, but then I mean the other part of it, I think that Melissa Otis does really nicely in her book is that she's looking at the historic period, and so she's looking at the time period where one might look at a house foundation or the remains of a campsite and not be able to distinguish what is quote unquote indigenous or what is quote unquote Euro-American, European, because the house forms were similar, the camping debris, the kinds of archaeological materials are they're not going to do that telling. So the story has to be told, as Sue is indicating before, through the ethnohistoric record and through oral history and interviews with people, and that's where the real research comes into it. And it's not easy. I mean, and it'll take a long time.
Right. Yeah. This, we've agreed this is a long-term project.
Yeah.
That's, we've already been at it for, 10 months. We started in January, and we're getting to the point now where we feel we're ready to publish something, but it's, we've done quite a bit of research over the last 10 months. You might have noticed that Susan laughed when you mentioned the marker in High Rock Park, and I think I know why. And Susan, do you want to tell us about that marker and how that's instructive to us?
Sure. And again, Siobhan and I believe, share a similar perspective on that marker. But the marker basically is, first of all, it describes this area as having been part of Iroquois territory, because it's the Iroquois that brought Sir William Johnson here, which it most likely was not. Traditionally, this was Algonquian, Mohegan territory, up until all of the perturbations brought in by the European settlement and the fur trade in particular. But anyway, it tells the story of the Mohawks bringing Sir William Johnson to High Rock Springs to heal his old war wounds, and of course, since it's written history, we tend to think that this is the truth. And this is a story that is told many times over in histories of Saratoga. I cannot remember the name of the author. Saratoga History of a Gilded Era or an Impious, or I can't remember the name. And anyway, it's one of the foundational histories of Saratoga. Is starts by telling that story, and so everybody thinks it's true, but scholars have subsequently researched that story. By everybody, I mean the public in general tends to accept the story. People who read these books tend to accept the story, but scholars have researched the story. They've gone through William Johnson's diaries and not found any evidence at all that he ever came to a spring in near Saratoga Springs in order to take healing water. So it's kind of a fabricated mythological story. It's a story, I think, that the underpinnings of the story are particularly detrimental to our understanding of Indigenous white contact, because they promote the myth that of white settlers being invited into the area, taking care of the area, this seamless transition as colonial settlers are brought into the area, that sort of the land is just kind of given over to them. But and then like the Indians disappear. But that's just so patently not the case. There are all different kinds of interactions between Native peoples and the colonial settlers. Some of them, for sure, were quite amicable, but others were there was a contested and tense relationship as well, and that kind of actuality is erased by this kind of mythological telling of Henry Johnson being somehow brought into Saratoga Springs, and voila, we now know it's there, and now history can begin because the white folks are here.
Is there any way that you see that this map that we're doing can be helpful in land acknowledgement? Is there any, or is that overreaching, to think that we could actually help people identify specific acknowledgements that they should be making in certain areas?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I think it could. And I'm not sure exactly what how the message would be crafted, but certainly, and I think you're working toward this now, just sort of getting people familiar or making the public in general familiar with the known identities of the groups of Indigenous people who were in the area at the time of the arrival of the first settler colonists would I think be very would be very useful. Sort of sketching out sort of the Abenaki, the Iroquois, and the Mohegan, sort of in this general upstate, eastern upstate area. I think would be useful. I would avoid any kind of any kind of a reference to trying to have like specific a map with specific boundaries, if you will, because
right,
as who knows what they were, and again that's our notion that we'd be imposing on how Indigenous folks actually interact with the land. But instead, what you'd want to do is maybe in a word picture, if you will, describe their general locations as we know them relative to each other and to the landscape as you're depicting it. Any other ideas, Siobhan?
Yeah, I think the value of land acknowledgement is increasing general public awareness of Indigenous presence and Indigenous land rights, and bringing visibility to that and amplifying that message in the public domain. I think that's the value of it. The problems with it are that it can often seem to be kind of virtue signaling and seen as something that is, done and in a box, and then there's no action or real meaningful change that comes about after, right? Because, really confronting the legacies of colonialism really are about redistributing resources, particularly land, in a way that addresses the long-term legacy of colonialism, which has been dispossession of land and resources. So, I think that as an educational tool, a story map can do some of that work of, creating more recognition and awareness. And that I think is a good and useful thing. I think the important thing to connect to are the contemporary Indigenous communities. So not just being past looking about, about the story of a place only related to Indigenous peoples in the past, but making that very clear and direct connection to communities in the present, whether they are diasporic Indigenous communities who may be reestablishing or reaffirming relationships to ancestral homelands, as in the case of the Stockbridge Munsee Mohican, who've been doing a lot of work in the last decade or so, to not only be present in their ancestral homeland, from their reservation in Wisconsin, but actually establishing, real physical presence, reestablishing a real physical presence back in homeland, or whether it is, connecting to Haudenosaunee, specifically Mohawk communities. I saw on your list of places that that you were thinking about including the Mohawk community, reestablished Mohawk community in Fonda, that Tom Porter and others have been a part of that. I think that's really important and huge. I think connecting to language and some of the work, really important work that's being done around Indigenous language teaching and learning, whether that's through Ganawa Halege in Fonda or through the work of Jesse Bruchak and other folks at the Endakana Education Center around Abenaki language. I think there's something there. So, to boil it down, yes, I think a story map can do some work that land acknowledgements seek to do, but it's really important to make that connection between past and present and not just be past looking, which is one of the great criticisms of archaeology for a long time. That's what archaeologists were interested in, and they had blinders on to the Indigenous communities that were living and caring about the treatment of their ancestors and the treatment of their cultural remains.
Great, thanks. We made a list of 4 areas that we wanted to be sure we covered today. So why don't I just run down them? We've talked about some of this, but I imagine that you'll have more to say on each of these. We wanted to explore the relationship between Indigenous people and the land they inhabited. Do you have anything more to say on that?
I think we've covered.
Okay. We've
Siobhan,
covered that.
you see
That's
anything that
good.
we didn't?
No. I mean, I think the takeaway point there for me is always about, connection to place doesn't have to only be material, even though that's kind of my, Sue and I, our perspective as people interested in material culture, that's our entry point. But there, through transmitted cultural knowledge, through oral traditions, through, there are many other intangible connections to place that communities can have, and that may be less visible in places like Cohoes Falls, for example.
Okay. Another area, the difference between the 2 cultural groups that inhabited the area, Algonquin and Iroquoian speakers, in terms of their subsistence and settlement patterns and social/political organization. More to say there?
Well, that's a big one, and there's a lot to say. And I think for purposes of this this discussion, it needs to be sort of not way deep in depth and just sort of schematic. But I think that this is something that somehow you're gonna want to build into your material so that folks understand those differences. So Algonquian and Iroquoian, basically, even though we associate them with cultural groups, are language stocks, language groups, and they're quite different. They have no common ancestral language. They're quite different languages. And along with sort of this linguistic difference also comes cultural differences as well. But I don't want to make that sound too stark, because we also know that there's a great deal of exchange between Iroquoian speakers and Mohican and Algonquian speakers. And so there's lots of shared material culture that we see archaeologically. There's lots of there are other sort of, I'm sure there's plenty of genetic sharing going on as well. Is another possibility. But they were quite distinctive cultures, and lived very distinctive archaeological imprints, if you will, so that the Iroquois folks tended to live in larger aggregates. They lived in settlements that were stockaded, and a number of them have been in. All of the stockaded settlements that are well known and documented are all west of Schenectady. They within these settlements they constructed dwellings called longhouses, which were these very long houses, which housed people who were matrilineally related. They were intensive corn agriculturalists, although they did supplement their agriculture with wild foraged and hunted foods as well. They also and again, roughly 1,000 years ago, and they confederated with or rather 5 or 6 Iroquois-speaking tribes confederated to create a kind of basically a federal system of governance is what it is, where each tribe was like a state. In other words, it had its own laws and leaders and so on, but there was an overarching confederation that they brought together for purposes of alliance, in other words, not warring on each other, and protection against influences imposing on them, but also for expansion purposes too. They did expand their boundaries fairly aggressively during that time period as well. So that in comparison, the Algonquian speakers of the Upper Hudson Valley and points east and south from there tended to be they also practiced agriculture, but less intensively. Agriculture being introduced into the Northeast, I don't know, was 2,000 years ago still a good date, Siobhan, or has somebody come up with a new one?
I think maize comes in around 1,000 BP. So,
okay,
yes, around 1,000 years ago. I mean, it is when we start really see like farming, more intensive horticulture turn agriculture.
Okay. And I read something recently out of the Field Museum where they're talking about 2,000 years ago, which is where that number came from. I'd always learned 1,000, so I thought, oh, gee, I've just been out of touch. There must be a new date. Okay, I'm happy with I'm much happier with 1,000 date as well. Okay, good. But less intensive agriculture and lived in smaller settlements, probably, and moved more frequently than the Iroquois, and also matrilineally organized, if you will. And the Mohegan was one of a number of different Algonquian groups, the Lenape or Lenape, depending on how you pronounce it, south of here, and then other tribes, a multitude of them to the east into Massachusetts and Connecticut, and those areas. So that's sort of a thumbnail. Any other important?
No, the thing I would just add on to that is that the fact of these different subsistence, settlement, and social organization patterns that sort of track these broader linguistic groups has a consequence for contact and colonialism, because early Europeans, when they observe the way that the Haudenosaunee are living in these villages that they're occupying for, 10, sometimes 20, 30 years, farming, with a pretty clear and intelligible socio-political organization, it translates fairly well to the European worldview. The Algonquin people are just, to the colonists, are really they're really hard to understand, and so you have colonists who are writing about and recording, these ethnohistoric accounts of Native peoples, particularly Algonquin speakers, who are saying, well, they're always moving, right? We don't know, sometimes they're there, and then all of a sudden a week later they're gone. They're always removing to somewhere else. And that what some archaeologists call the mobile farmer subsistence strategy, living in, sometimes in smaller kin-based family groups, dispersing, coming back together at different times of year for, say, resource harvesting, during the spring fish runs, or during the large, fall nut harvest, right? That was a seasonal round that to the European mind was not, didn't make sense. These weren't settled people. They weren't people who were, living and using the land in the way that that computed for Europeans. So the visibility of Algonquin speakers in the 17th century, and in the way that they're written about, and then what kind of becomes the predominant view of Algonquin peoples, the wrong-headed predominant view of Algonquin peoples, is that they were quote unquote nomads, that they were small populations, that they didn't live in a single place, and that was them not being civilized, but also not having the same kinds of connection to place that, say, Haudenosaunee or Iroquoian speakers had.
Yeah, I would add to that. What was it? Just left. Oh well.
That's okay. Can I jump in with a question?
Sure.
One thing that has really struck me just digging into this whole subject is the extent to which the European settlement was based on the fur trade, and the importance of the fur trade in this early history. And as you talk about these two different peoples, like how did they respond differently to the arrival of the Europeans?
Before we answer
Sure.
that,
Okay.
I want to get back, and actually, in some ways, this might be a segue. What I wanted to add to what Siobhan was saying was that because of the Iroquois being organized in a way that was more comprehensible and apparent to the early settlers, interactions with them and descriptions of them are so much more dominant in the written histories, so that and particularly in New York State, in this area of New York State, where you're in a borderland area, and where the colonists are in fact interacting with the two different populations. Because the Iroquois were so more understandable, more comprehensive, and in the eyes of the Europeans, more powerful, they get written about. Their terminology gets adopted. Their ritual is what gets incorporated into exchanges. And so they dominate the written histories, if you will, of the early contact and colonial period, and that's one of the ways in which Mohegan history has been, if you will, lost. And a good example of that is coming back to High Rock Park, the way that became a Mohawk story. Even though we know that we were in, we know that we were in Mohican territory here.
Which makes it a challenge for us, because as we're trying to write up these histories of various places, we are finding these conflicting accounts. There's kind of the acknowledged, the established account, but then there's actually, you know what, the real story is different.
I think there's, well, again, I haven't been active in the area for years, but when I was, and I presume it's still the case, there's just lots of discussion about, was it this or was it that? There's still a lot of questions about dates when things happen. There's still a lot of questions about belongingness, if you will.
But I don't think it has to be this or that. I think that's the, coming back to the point, what you were saying, Dan, earlier about your goal with the story map and this sort of layering on of stories, going back to the beginning of our conversation about persistent places and places sort of accumulating or accruing meaning over time. It can be both and. It doesn't have to be either or. And actually, if you look at the way that, if and when you speak to folks within Indigenous communities about these places, when I have heard folks talk about, say, Saratoga, the mineral springs, it is not a claim of a place only for, our people, whoever our people are. It is a recognition of the place being important to our people, not to the exclusion of other people. The problem arises when, as Sue pointed out, one version of a story gets put on a bronze plaque on a rock in a park, and that's the one that people who don't know or don't understand these changing meanings and associations over time, then they think, oh, it's just one, right? It's only important to, or the story is only about, Sir William Johnson being brought here by the Mohawk to the exclusion of all others. I also think that's where land acknowledgements can be somewhat useful, because they do offer an opportunity to literally name the multiple groups of people who have lived in a place and who consider that place to be homeland or territory or ancestral land over time. So I don't think it has to be an either or. And my experience and most of my work is focused on Southern New England, but it's the same thing. It's the mythologized story about national origins and, kind of setting up this, as Sue said at the beginning, Indigenous peoples are here. In the case of Massachusetts Bay Colony, it's, English coming in, and there's a kind of seamless transition. There's a little bit of blood, a little bit of genocide, but we don't, talk about that quite as much. And then, here's the one story, right? And it's so deeply problematic because it keeps reproducing this idea that there's only one version of a history and only one way of knowing a place and only one legitimate association with that place, which does harm, in the case of many places in Algonquin places, I think harms Algonquin people. And it's not the Haudenosaunee that are who are harming. It's the elevating one story over another and not allowing them to coexist.
Yeah. Well, what it really says to me is that we have to be very inclusive in the way we produce this story map. We really have to hear all these different perspectives and somehow bring them together and publish them in a way that reflects, to some degree, a consensus of what actually happened, the history of all this. So we're coming up on Indigenous Peoples Day. Would you both reflect on what that means to you and what you would suggest that it means to all of us? How should we observe this day? What should we think about?
I don't want to give away all of the things that I'm going to say on Sunday.
Oh, that's true. Okay, well, I should mention. I haven't mentioned this, but Professors Hart and Bender will be at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Saratoga Springs at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. So if you want to hear their thoughts on Indigenous Peoples Day, come on over and hear what they have to say. Should we leave it that way, or would you like to give us a little bit of a teaser?
I have been thinking about this a lot since the invitation was extended, and the short version of it is that, one of the things, I am a settler, right? My ancestors are not from this place. This is my home, right? Those two things can exist at the same time. And as I think about what that means for myself as someone who has lived in the American Northeast, in the homelands of many different Native nations over the course of my life, and as someone who's an archaeologist, and part of a discipline that has a really fraught history with Indigenous peoples and has done a lot of harm to Indigenous individuals and communities, I struggle with this. And so I reflect a lot on what I've inherited and what we've all inherited as kind of, as in my case, as a settler and as an archaeologist. And I also think about ways to be what some scholars have recently called being a bad settler. What does it mean to be a bad settler? And that's kind of how I try to guide the work that I do, the archaeology that I do, which is, to the frustration of some, really, really slow work, because of, all of the things that Dan, you just mentioned, that, being inclusive and being really thoughtful and deliberate and considering the different kinds of stories that come out of archaeological work, interpretive stories that come out of archaeological work, being uncomfortable, like it just, we have to be okay with being uncomfortable, recognizing colonial privilege and being unsettled by it. We collectively should be unsettled by it. And then, thinking about how to enact change and doing that in whatever places, we have the most power and privilege, whether that's, internal to an institution like Skidmore or a workplace, or within a county, right? If it's a school, community, whatever it might be, and doing the work of taking responsibility for our self-education and then turning that into some kind of meaningful action, right? That, like, the critique of the land acknowledgement just being words and virtue signaling, taking a land acknowledgement seriously and moving it to some kind of, real consequential action. So those are the things that I guess I think about with respect to Indigenous Peoples Day, which, was the came out of a kind of Indigenous led response to the marking of the 500th anniversary of the Columbian expedition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Susan, anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I would say that Siobhan and I are in different archaeological generations. She now has my position at Skidmore, and so she grew up in a time when the discipline has become increasingly aware of these issues. I grew up in the discipline in the time that Siobhan alluded to earlier, where and being really accused of, and it is absolutely true, we were firmly rooted in the past, and we didn't really connect our work to contemporary populations, Indigenous populations. And for me, so in some ways, Indigenous People Day is almost like a day of atonement. because I look back on the discipline that I grew up in, the work that I did in, and have regrets that I wasn't part of it. I wasn't part of this new wave of sort of spending the time that Siobhan talks about, that it takes to be consultative with Indigenous communities and so on. So I have a sense of regret around that, but I've tried to. But one of the things that I did do, I think, in the last part of my career, was to become ever more active in the areas of the discipline that were beginning to expand and look outside the boundaries of other professional archaeologists, and think about our interactions with communities with which we conduct our work and who are affected by our work. And I feel profoundly grateful for that growth. And one of the things that I try to do then is to be I've tried to be supportive as much as possible to initiatives like this one that are about trying to, if you will, change the public discourse and perceptions about the place and role of Native folks, Indigenous folks in this nation's history, as well as the depth of the time depth and the space depth and the complexity depth of the peoples who were here before the first settler colonists came to this nation. So I've tried to work in various forms of that kind of public education as part of my way of giving back.